Now that we understand the basics, let's have a look at the kinds of molecules that carbon can form. The astounding variety of compounds in biochemistry is basically a combination of hydrocarbon chains and rings and functional groups. Hydrocarbons, as the name says, are compounds of just carbon and hydrogen. These can be chains, branch chains, rings, and combinations of all that. To spare us having to write down all those C's and H's, we often use a very simplified stick diagram where every corner is a carbon atom, every edge a carbon-carbon single bond, and all valences of carbon that are not specified otherwise are assumed to have a hydrogen, like so. As you can see, for clarity, we often still write out the terminal carbons and hydrogens. Hydrocarbons are important because they form the bulk of crude oil and petrol, but they have no major role in biochemistry. This is because they don't do any chemistry, they don't react. Practically all the exciting biochemistry that happens in a cell happens because of functional groups. These are decorations of hydrocarbon chains that confer specific chemical properties and reactivity to a molecule. All functional groups contain at least one atom or a combination of oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and/or phosphorus. Many molecules have more than one functional group, but each of these groups confers similar physical and chemical properties to whichever molecule they are on. Let's try and get some order into those functional groups. As they appear on the screen, you may want to scribble them onto a piece of paper to make it easier to remember them. A carbon atom can be oxidized to 3 different levels depending on how many covalent bonds it has with oxygen. A single OH group is called a hydroxyl group or alcohol group. You may be familiar with this alcohol, called ethanol. Note how the hydroxyl group is indicated with the OL suffix, ethanol. The next higher level of oxidation gives us the aldehydes and ketones, with the name depending on where the oxidized carbon sits. If it's at the end, it's an aldehyde. If it's in the middle, a ketone. The functional group on its own is sometimes called a carbonyl group. A very important group of compounds has combinations of multiple hydroxyl groups and one aldehyde or ketone group, the sugars. Finally, we have the carboxyl group. Any more oxidized and you get carbon dioxide. The hydrogen on this group can dissociate, and this is why molecules with a carboxyl group are acids. The deprotonated group is called carboxylate. You might already know some of the simple carboxylic acids: formic acid, acetic acid, propionic and butyric acid, with 1, 2, 3, and 4 carbon atoms, and maybe some of the longer ones like palmitic acid. Without the hydroxyl group, acetic acid becomes a functional group called acetyl group that can be attached to other molecules. The same is true for all the other carboxylic acids, but among these small ones, the acetyl group is by far the most common and the most important in biochemistry. When we talk generically about the equivalent functional groups of the larger carboxylic acids, we call them acyl groups. Other important functional groups include the sulfhydryl group, the amino group, and the phosphate group. The sulfhydryl group can do some of the same chemistry as the hydroxyl group, but also some unique types of bonds that are important for protein structure, as you will see later. An important thing to remember about amino groups and phosphate groups is that they are charged in neutral environments. The amino group is basic and becomes protonated, so it carries a positive charge, and the phosphate group is highly acidic, so it is practically always deprotonated and negatively charged. So let's recap. Functional groups are small groups of atoms that confer specific reactivity to a molecule. Many molecules have more than one functional group, and like with a Swiss Army knife, each one adds a specific reactivity. You should now be able to recognize and ideally draw all of the following functional groups: the hydroxyl group or alcohol group, sulfhydryl groups or thiols, the carbonyl group in aldehydes and ketones, acetyl and acyl groups, carboxylates, amino and phosphoryl groups. Let's have a look at a complex molecule called acetyl coenzyme A. Do you recognize the labeled groups? Press pause if you want to have a go yourself.